Hi, Senator Lee. Thank you very much for taking my question. I'm wanting to know, since Congress is the body that is supposed to make laws, how does the make a law changing the definition of marriage?
Okay. So
Congress got it.
how does that make sense? Well, the short answer to your question is that problems arise anytime anyone in any branch of government steps out of their lane. In other words, we've got three branches of government: the legislative branch, where I work, Congress, whose job it is to make the laws; the executive branch, whose job it is to execute, implement, and enforce those same laws. The executive branch, of course, being headed by the president; and then the judiciary, headed by the Supreme Court, whose job it is to interpret laws where multiple parties can't agree on their meaning. Anytime you've got one of the other branches that's not Congress making the law, changing the law, you've got problems. Now, in the case of the Supreme Court of the United States changing the law of the land so as to force every single state in the Union to recognize same-sex marriage, contrary to the public policy established by that state's lawmakers, you've got a real problem. Because there you've got not only the Supreme Court making law, but the Supreme Court making law not just for the federal government, but for all the states. So this violates two of the Constitution's most important structural protections. One is that most of the power is supposed to remain at the local level, at the state level, closest to the people. Another is this separation of powers principle that we've been discussing. But in some instances, the Supreme Court of the United States will conclude that the Constitution prohibits something. And if it's making it up as it goes along, then it's doing great damage to our constitutional structure. This is a really difficult thing, because once it's deemed to be part of the Constitution, you can't get around it except by constitutional amendment, which is very difficult to achieve. Whereas the Supreme Court ruling itself is not nearly as difficult to achieve as an amendment to the United States Constitution. And it's interesting also, a lot of damage is done by the Supreme Court invalidating laws that are not in fact unconstitutional. That happened, in my opinion, when the Supreme Court issued its ruling a few months ago on the same-sex marriage issue. In other instances, the Supreme Court fails to invalidate a law that is unconstitutional. I believe that happened a couple of years ago in the case involving the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act, also known as Obamacare. It's just as bad when the Supreme Court fails to invalidate an unconstitutional law as when it does invalidate a law that's not unconstitutional. Both are bad, and it's one of the reasons why we've got to be very careful about who we elect to the White House, because who we elect to the White House determines who's going to make their way onto the Supreme Court. We've got to have men and women serving within our federal court system who love and respect and revere and honor the law. And I'll fight every single day I'm in the United States Senate to make sure that we don't confirm judges and justices who won't respect and revere and honor the law.
Great.
It's also one of the reasons why I've introduced the First Amendment Defense Act. In response to that ruling by the Supreme Court, I've introduced this legislation to make sure that now that the Supreme Court's ruled on that case, I don't want any agency of the federal government taking any adverse or retaliatory action against any individual or any person based on their religious beliefs about marriage. That's your business. That's your religious beliefs that are at stake, and they shouldn't be the subject of punishment. They shouldn't draw any kind of retaliation by the federal government.